A 17-year-old teen and her mother are facing criminal charges in Nebraska after officials subpoenaed the teen's Facebook direct messages and found that she had an at-home abortion at 23 weeks, violating state law that bans the procedure after 20 weeks. Police in Nebraska subpoenaed Facebook for the teen's private chat, which allegedly showed she and her mother had bought an at-home abortion medication and disposed of the fetus after. Here to discuss is Kate Klonick, professor of internet law at St. John's University and fellow at the Brookings Institution. Kate, welcome.
Thank you for having me.
So walk us through exactly what is kind of novel or unprecedented here about the information that Facebook disclosed.
Yeah, actually, there's very little that's novel about this. This happens all the time in criminal investigations. There are subpoenas or there are search warrants that are served on Facebook or Meta or any type of platform that keeps your information that actually just requests them to give over whatever they have about the crime or communications that you had around a certain type of crime. And that's exactly what happened here. I think that one of the things that is capturing people's imagination at the moment is that there is kind of a misconception that this was one of the moments that we've been hearing about that would happen about basically the platforms having access to your private information and the police using that in a post-Roe world. And so I think that that is kind of, even though that's not exactly what's happening here, that is one of the things that is like kind of captured people's headlines and minds at this moment.
Well, it is because it's the case, correct, that Facebook broadly cooperates with law enforcement like other companies. If they serve you a subpoena, if they ask for records, except in rare circumstances, right? There are not brave stands on behalf of these companies. They give law enforcement the records that are requested.
Yep, that's exactly right. And there was a crime here under Nebraska law. 20 weeks is the cutoff, as you said previously. And so there really was nothing that Facebook could have done besides going to bat against law enforcement. And if you look at the search warrant affidavits, there was no mention of abortion in any of the search warrant affidavits. So it's not clear that this would have set off any flags in the company, that this was a political issue. It's not clear that it is a political issue. But again, it highlights something that everyone should be aware of, which is how this process works and that these companies work with law enforcement.
Well, investigative reporting published in the markup reveals that Facebook is actively gathering data about people who visit crisis pregnancy center websites, including sensitive information like if they're considering abortion, looking to get a pregnancy test, or emergency contraceptives. Now, this data gathering tool works even when user is logged out, not logged into Facebook. It's intended actually to procure information for advertising purposes, right? The company's plan here is not, well, it's not nefarious in the way people would maybe describe it. If you think the process of selling advertising is nefarious, then you'd say it's nefarious. But they're gathering this information because they want a more well-rounded portrait of the user, so they can show them relevant ads, things they might likely to buy and make money. But we're learning how that process can be used for law enforcement purposes on issues like this or other things. Is that correct?
No, that's a perfect way of putting it. This is not some type of new kind of surveillance that companies are rolling out because they're anti-abortion or anything else. This is stuff that has been going on forever. Again, it's just becoming aware in most people's minds, frankly, now that abortion is possibly criminalized at such early stages, at moments that we never had kind of anticipated before. So there's a new criminal set of statutes, and now there's a danger of kind of people feeling like they're the dolphins that are going to get caught in the net, or there's kind of this idea that, as the markup kind of points out, that totally kind of benign advertising or business related, I roll my eyes with benign because it's not clear, as you said, whether or not it's benign, but advertising related things will end up becoming in the service of law enforcement and surveillance. And that's just kind of something that's on the table in a post-Roe world.
So you said earlier that there's nothing really that Facebook can do, but isn't it the case that if these messages were encrypted via end-to-end encryption, then Facebook would not have been able to hand them over? And in fact, Facebook users can opt into it, but it's not the default setting until I think at some point next year they're going to be moving to automatic end-to-end encryption.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So there's a couple of really interesting things about Facebook Messenger, and if I can just bore you quickly with the details. When you're in browser on Facebook, it is integrated as part of the platform. Those are not possible to encrypt in browser settings for technical reasons I won't get into. But when you're using Messenger as a separate app on your phone, those are possible to opt into end-to-end encryption, and it's not the default setting. And so you have to go and set that up automatically. What end-to-end encryption does is it keeps it so that platforms are never basically in receipt of any cognizable form of your messages. They appear on your phone and they appear on the phone of the person that you're messaging. And so if they're not deleted and someone captures your phone, you're still kind of out of luck with end-to-end encryption. But what happens there is that Facebook can't be the one handing them over. They literally don't have anything to hand over in an end-to-end encryption scenario. And so that is what's happening. The bad part of that, obviously, is that a lot of people do a lot of bad things, from child sexual abuse material to drug trade to sex exploitation. There's all kinds of things that the end-to-end encryption enables, as well as completely legitimate private conversations.
Do we know anything about why it is that Facebook is making the choice to move to end-to-end encryption as the more of the default setting?
Well, it's certainly not in their business interests. It actually cuts against that. But I think that one of the reasons is that it does, in some ways, possibly take some of the heat off of them when they get these exact type of scenarios. Right now, Facebook is having a bad day in PR because of this case, even though that they did nothing necessarily that they haven't done a million times before, and cooperating with police. This basically kicks the can down the road, or just allows them to avoid doing this type of surveillance on behalf of police, and that's the end of that.
And obviously it's in Meta's interest. I mean, they get so much. The social media platforms in general, right? They get so much criticism for, they're very much in a damned if they do, damned if they don't, with a lot of this kind of law enforcement compliance with the organizing of violence or terrorism, or violence related to January 6th political protests, et cetera. They're criticized for allowing too much of it on their platform, but then they're also reporting all the time. They do report when they see violence being organized, constantly. So I think the average person has maybe not their awareness of what these social media companies are doing in order to comply with law enforcement is not broadly publicized.
Oh yeah, and that's kind of what I started off kind of talking about and trying to highlight. This is really a learning opportunity in a moment. None of this is super new or different. If you follow this stuff all the time, like I do, or a lot of people do, this is not a huge sea change. This shouldn't have surprised you. I think I in fact said that to your producer when I agreed to come on. But I do think that it is a moment of education. We are in a huge norm setting kind of and cultural education moment around the privacy protections and around our literacy around these areas and these platforms, what they're capable of. And this is one piece of that. And so it happens iteratively, and it happens, piece by piece, and we get it wrong and we correct ourselves. And I think that this is kind of the upside of this, is hopefully people come out of this more aware of what they can do to protect themselves and what is actually happening between law enforcement and the platforms.
What might law enforcement have done in an era before social media, for instance, if they wanted to gather evidence on a crime like this? Could they would have gotten the records from a credit card company if there was a financial transaction for this kind of stuff? Would that, is it, in keeping with that kind of thing?
Yep, there's a bunch of, actually, it's a wonderful question. I was actually drafting a thread about this earlier today. There's the Stored Communications Act, and there's the Electronic Communications Privacy Act, and there's Protection Act, and there's a lot of stuff that that law enforcement could have utilized, and they do utilize those. All of those acts are now applied to social media, and so there is a fair amount of stuff that they could have done. But like likely will do if things become end-to-end encrypted, they will have to find other ways to make these cases. That's a really hard ask in an era of for law enforcement, and they're really chasing some very bad guys. When you have situations in which people are completely anonymous and using end-to-end encryption, it is almost impossible to try and track some of these things.
Well, thank you for that, Kate. It is an interesting point that you raise about this not being novel, especially because even the abortion piece is not really a consequence of the Dobbs decision. The 23 weeks was already after the 20-week barrier that existed in Kansas pre-Roe being overturned. So this really does seem like one of those cases that does raise for people issues about whether or not they think the status quo is fair and just and good, but not necessarily implicating the more current news stories. Thank you for edifying us, Kate.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. There's a saying in trust and safety, which is typically kind of this area, which is essentially, my friend Charlotte says, it is trade-offs and sadness. There are really no good, there are really no great outcomes, unfortunately, for a lot of this stuff. And the more people kind of realize that these are philosophical issues and ethical issues almost, rather than technical issues, I think the better we'll be.
Thank you for that. And we'll have more Rising for you after this.